Good afternoon, everyone. We just opened up the room, so we're going to allow folks to come in. If my fellow co-hosts can man the waiting room and admit individuals, we'll now begin. Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Plonzinski Figueroa. I'm co-founder of La Cumbre, Latinos United for Progress, and one of the 3 co-chairs for the Greater Rochester Latino Latinx Roundtable. We welcome you here today for joining us as we discuss our October 2021 released Latinx agenda, the fierce urgency of yesterday. We appreciate all of the community stakeholders, elected officials, community leaders, business leaders, and individuals interested in supporting the Latinx community in the Greater Rochester area and the Greater Monroe County area, and appreciate your time today. We're going to go over a little bit of the lay of the land, and so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, co-chair and council president, Miguel Melendez.
Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to echo my colleague here in thanking everyone for making the time for our community. It's critically important that we continue to make progress as we hopefully exit the pandemic at some point in our lives. But also just there's a lot of longstanding issues in our community that we've been faced with and charged with. So I want to acknowledge everyone who's been part of the Latinx agenda. We certainly have a long list. If you take a look at the report of individuals who contributed, over 60 plus members of our community have been part of this agenda in some way, shape, or form. And we look to continue to expand on that and to build bridges to progress for our community. So with that, we do have some presentations that we'll be going over today. And at some point, we'll go through the breakouts. We'll have a breakout session. All of you have registered for 1 of 5 breakouts, and do a little debrief at the end. So that's the overall lay of the land for the day. Anthony, are you going to lead us with the presentation?
If you could share, Miguel, and then we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. All right, just calling it up, everyone.
All right, so we'll begin by going over a short agenda to kind of give you an idea of what the lay of the land is for today. You can call that next slide up. So as we introduced ourselves with the Greater Rochester Latinx Agenda and Roundtable, presenting our agenda today. As many things within the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that brought many communities together, that also brought us together in terms of finding a united way to present our advocacy within the community. In March 2020, we began weekly meetings of this group that grew from there largely, and we have been meeting ever since, every Monday at 1 o'clock via Zoom. COVID-19, while it has been a huge issue within our community and has really devastated many of them, one of the things that we have seen in the silver lining is that it has brought us together and uniting to figure out how do we advance the agenda for the Latinx community in Greater Monroe County, and how do we do that as one united front. So today we're going to focus on only a few of our key areas within our agenda. Before this meeting, you received a link to the greater agenda, which includes many more sections. We will only be focusing on the areas of health, arts and culture, civic engagement, education, and language access today. While this is only just a glimpse of the agenda and our focus, we want to ensure that you point yourselves to the greater agenda, as we'll be working with individuals to focus on those areas and find solutions to those problems moving forward. We will all present each of these sections to you as a whole group in a plenary format. After the main plenary format, we will then break up into groups, which you have pre-selected in your registration, and you will be broken up into those groups to focus in on your chosen focus area, where we can have a deeper conversation led by our roundtable members. If you're just registering this afternoon, right before this meeting, I will register you into a group as we break out into those groups. If you registered before today, you were already auto-assigned by the selection that you made. And we can move to the, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just a quick highlight of the report itself. It's all available on rochesterlatinx.org, and you can download a full copy or you can thumb through the report there. And as a high-level overview, this is what you might see in any of the sections of the report. So we have a summary of the statement or a brief statement of the focus area of the problem, some background information in terms of what's going on locally, nationally, across the state, and then some very specific recommendations, which those recommendations you'll see today in some of the breakout sessions. And then finally, each section of the report has references. So if you wanted to dive deeper into the report, you're able to do that on your own as well. So our intention with this report is to lay the foundation. There's a lot of work that needs to happen post-report. This will not be a shelf plan. Our whole roundtable team is going to be engaging across sectors in this community, and we need your support to implement our recommendations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sadie Alvarado Fisher, who will kick us off.
Thanks, Miguel. So as Miguel was saying earlier, we're all here because we have a shared commitment to inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And we all want to create positive systemic changes. Yet too often, the history and experiences of the Latinx community are excluded. Whether they are our positive contributions, such as Sylvia Mendez's role in the landmark 1947 case, Mendez versus Westminster, a case that banned segregation in California public schools and paved the way for the national ban on segregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education 7 years later. Or whether it's part of the dark history of forced sterilization in this country. Many forget that from the 1930s to the 1970s, nearly 1/3 of women in Puerto Rico were coerced into sterilization when government officials claimed that Puerto Rico's economy would benefit from a reduced population. So whether positive or negative, we're often excluded and or forgotten. But just like with other historically marginalized communities, we also experience racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, and other forms of discrimination and microaggressions. Next slide, please. So Rosa Isela Cervantes works at the University of New Mexico, and she advises the president there on Latino affairs. She shares examples of how Latinos experience not only racism, but other forms of microaggressions as well. When it comes to race, Rosa says, people assume we all look the same. But racially, we go from the whitest of white to the darkest of dark. We run the gamut when it comes to skin color. And there's so much intersectionality with Latinos. In addition, when we not only think about our race or think about skin color, too, not all of us speak Spanish, and not all of us identify as Hispanic or Latino or even Latinx. We're a complex community. But people often try to change our names even. Rosa becomes Rose, Pedro becomes Peter, or even sometimes we begin to change our names ourselves just to be able to assimilate and try to fit into the dominant culture. In terms of language, people assume that if you have an accent, you're not as intelligent as others, or that maybe they start to speak slower, or think that in some ways we simply can't understand just because of our accents. So why is this important, and why think about racism and microaggressions as they relate to Latinx communities? Well, because today we don't want you to just listen and empathize. We want you to leave today inspired to take further action to ensure that your IDEA efforts, your DEI efforts, or whatever you call them at your organizations, that they explicitly address the needs of the Latinx community. So today, as was mentioned earlier, we will focus on the impacts of systemic racism on the Latinx experiences, whether in health, arts and culture, civic engagement, education, and language access. And we will provide actionable recommendations for you to mitigate those inequities. Anthony will now start us off with education.
So the work is a part of our Latino Education Task Force and our Education Committee as a member of the roundtable. It builds off of over 50 years of advocacy within the greater Rochester community for educational issues. While at first focused within the Rochester City School District, we have now branched off and are now focusing on each of our town and county areas, municipalities within, as the Latino community continues to grow outward from the city of Rochester into our surrounding suburbs. It's important to note that even though I've mentioned that 50 years of advocacy have gone into this report, very little has been done to address the concerns and the issues within the Latinx community, to address our educational issues according to graduation rates, stop out and dropout rates, Latino achievement, as well as addressing our social, emotional, and mental health issues that continue today. It is our hope that within this context in the education report, we can do more and reach you, the decision makers, to make an impact. We can go to the next slide, Miguel. We're hoping that with this data and this information, you can take it back to your respective communities, your respective offices and decision-making bodies, and really address the concerns that you see moving forward. We will have specific recommendations for you to act on, and hope that you will partner with us in ensuring that we can reach the Latino community and address the Latino educational concerns within that community. And we can move to the next slide. So we ask you to take our pledge today in order to focus in on that and to stand with us as we address those concerns. I will now turn it over to Lourdes, who will take us through the data.
Thank you, Anthony. So I want to just be very clear that this data that we're looking at is for all of Monroe County. So on the New York State Education data warehouse, this data is where this data came from. And we're looking specifically at just two things: the graduation rate of all Latinos, all students versus Latinos, and the dropout rate. So what I want to be clear here too is that Latinos in this data are not just your English language learners. So we often are looking at the English language learner data, but we are looking here strictly at Latinos, those that are English dominant, English proficient, and those that speak other languages, which makes up about 15 to 16% of the total student population. So when we look at the data here, in the blue bar, we see the graduation rate in 2018 and 2019, and 2019 and 2020, those blue lines. Those 2 years for all students, all races in general, they were 87% and 85% in Monroe County. But when we look at just the Latinos, it drops significantly, 78% in 1920 and to 74% in 1819. And if we look at the next slide, please, we're going to look at the graduation rates this past cohort, which came out later, after, so 2020, 2021, for all students in general, it was 88%. And for the Latino population, it was 76%, which is quite a significant drop just for the Latino population. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the dropout rates, it's also, there's some alarm here for me. When we look at 1819, the dropout rates, these are how many students in general, all the total population was about 12% in Monroe County. And half of, I'm sorry, for the Latinos was 12%. For all the students, it was 6%. So the dropout rate for Latinos is about double back in 1819. And we see the same trend in 1920, where for all students, the dropout rate was 4%. And for the Latino students, the dropout rate was at 9%, which is almost double, quite alarming. And then when we look at the 2020 and 21 data, Similar trends for the Latino population, 9%, and for all students, it was 4%. So for the past 3 cohorts of graduates, those are alarming statistics. Thank you. Next slide, please. And I'll go back to Anthony.
So of the recommendations that you see before you, 4 of them come from our 2010 study out of the University of Rochester, looking at Latinx student achievement and working with students and staff and community members over a 2-year span. That report was birthed out of a challenge from then Superintendent Jean-Claude Brizard that said, you're coming to us with your issues, but you have no data to back it up. Well, at that time, Ibero-American Action League and the community galvanized together to work with the University of Rochester to come up with a peer-reviewed report and a study that looked at the aspects of Latino achievement within the community. We will talk about these recommendations in more depth within our focus group. We wanted to present those here today to you now. Next, you'll see a pre-glimpse of the breakout questions within our focus group that we will be addressing at that time. Anali or Carlos?
So be Micah.
Or Micah, my apologies.
Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Anitza Perez. I am currently a vice principal at East with the U of R APO, and I oversee the bilingual program here at East Upper. And I also represent the NYSALAS, which is the New York State Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents. And I also, I'm not sure if Carlos is on, but he has also been the regional director for NYSALAS here in Rochester, and he represents as an assistant principal superintendent of innovation and equity and engagement in the Schenectady School District. And these are the goals for NYSALAS, and we will go into depth when we are in our breakout rooms. Next, Anali. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Anita Jesus Lopez, and I represent also the NYSALAS, which is the association, the New York State Association for Bilingual Education. And I'm a representative for our Region 5, along with my colleague Anali. And we will be going through in our breakout session a little bit about the organization, which focuses on bilingual education, equity, and access for all students, and promoting and sustaining and expanding bilingual education and advocacy for our students. So we'll be going over all our objectives for our organization as well.
And hi, I'm Anali Cruz Pomni, the Director of Bilingual Education. As Anit shared, we'll go a little bit more into depth over these objectives, and we're glad to be here with you today. And I'm going to shoot it over to Jackie Ortiz, who's going to talk about civic engagement.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jackie Ortiz, and I'm a member of the Latinx Roundtable and currently one of Monroe County's election commissioners. I will be co-presenting today with my partner, minority leader and county legislator, Eversha Roman. This section will provide a general landscape of the Latinx community's population, voting, ballot access measures, but it will also scratch the surface of how critical voices at the table are beyond elected office. The community has certainly made progress in a variety of local offices, but there is more to do to ensure adequate representation. And the reality is major policies, decisions, procedures, and allocation of funding is being done outside of Albany. Our corporate and nonprofit entities are both powerful and control access. And it is important that representation certainly is achieved, but we are seeking beyond checking the ethnicity box regarding leadership. We are seeking to achieve impactful insight based on lived experience that can only manifest itself when volume is realized. And finally, we'll speak a bit more specifically regarding a hallmark of advocacy for this group, and that is women's pay equity. I'm sorry, you could have turned the slide. So this talks a little bit more about what I just stated there. So I'll leave it there for a second and then have you move directly into the next slide, please. You can go ahead and do that for me. And all right, so this just really is a capture here. Monroe County population, no surprise to anyone, approximately 759,000 individuals within Monroe County, and within the Latinx community, population is somewhere between 70 and 80,000 individuals countywide. Although the majority still reside within city boundaries, that has certainly changed from approximately 79% of individuals back in the 80s to about 60% current day residing within city boundaries. And it is certainly a delicate balance to ensure that the community is being thought of and considered beyond the city of Rochester and really as Monroe County and even the Finger Lakes as a whole, but at the same time still keeping a keen eye and a sharp focus on our most heavily populated areas as well. And next slide, please. Registered voters in Monroe County. This gives you a little bit of a snapshot of our overall look at the county and the towns. And you can't, it looks like it's slightly cut off there maybe, but about 480,000 individuals are currently registered, even as of the last report on March 1st here in total. And of that, approximately 24,000 is what we would say are Latinx registered voters. The interesting part of this, if you could go to the next slide, really, and well, so actually here's kind of that breakout. When you take a look at the voter population, Rochester is, the city is still clearly the largest voting population base that we have in regards to the community. And the next slide also is a visual representation of that same subset of numbers, if you will. So you can take a look at that. And if you go to the next, yes.
Just real quick, for the sake of our interpreters, if you can slow it down a little bit, that'll be great.
Okay. Okay. So make sure you don't cut me off after 10 minutes then.
That is definitely happening.
So if you go to the next slide, the eligible voting population base. So in Monroe County, we're looking at approximately 603,000 eligible voters, for which I previously stated about 480,000 of them are currently registered. So about 79% of those eligible seem to be in fact registered. Whereas when we dissect the Latinx community, about 63,000 individuals are currently eligible to vote, but only about 24,000 are registered. So sitting at about 38% of those eligible, in fact, as registered. So there is a much larger disparity when looking at eligible versus registered. And with the larger gap of eligible versus registered, meeting community members where they are with easily digestible information and in language is key. And although it certainly is true that not all are in need of language access, a very good portion of the community does. And it is imperative that all are brought along. An educated constituency is a powerful one, and information must be both consistent and intentional. And the added complexity of language is a barrier for many still. We currently have about 855 election districts in Monroe County, and of that, approximately 305 of them are designated by law as Spanish districts, requiring both written and oral assistance when it comes to the voting process. It's certainly the case that there is a higher probability that voters could present themselves at any one of these districts or polling sites, but it is also very possible that these individuals can present themselves in other locations. And in being inclusive as much as possible and doing what I believe is our job here, and that is access, we have been taking a look at what procedures and process we have, also legal requirements, and as of this election cycle, all ballots will be bilingual ballots, regardless of the election district. We are also doing our best to fill all necessary sites with interpreting capabilities. And as part of that effort, we will be piloting new technology to ensure that Spanish and any other language, including ASL, will be accessed if needed. Because it is certainly true that our Latinx members can also be deaf and hard of hearing members of the community. If you take a look, we have been working very hard. There is the copy of kind of what the bilingual ballots will be looking like. If you click to the next slide, you will also see that the board has a variety of information on the website, and certainly thankful that the county has been working towards ensuring that language capabilities are available on the site. So by clicking a button, you can change it to Spanish and or any other language. So thankful and a work in progress. On this particular section here, you can put in your own personal information. You have the ability to see your registration status, elected officials, the offices for which you are eligible to vote, and a copy of that same bilingual ballot when the time comes. The task really here is to continue to bring awareness to the fact that this information exists and making sure that folks have access to it. So we continue to make improvements there. And even more so, we have been thinking about not only what we provide, but whom is providing this particular outreach in our communities. We are making a concerted effort here at the Board of Elections to ensure that the BOE is in fact on the road, and are very proud that we have new recruitment roles here at the Board of Elections, and that those individuals are not only tasked with ensuring a diverse workforce, but are also ensuring that the distribution of information and registration activities is occurring in communities of interest, which is very important. There are a number of other measures that we will talk about in our breakout sessions. And so what I would like to do in order to kind of keep us moving here is for everyone to think about who is responsible for ensuring reach and for being in tune with arguably one of your largest and certainly growing constituent client bases, and the breadth and depth of lived experience among decision makers that match that of the communities you serve are not a nice to have, but are a must. And with that, I hand it over to my partner, Ibero-American.
Thank you, Jackie. Again, my name is Ibero-American, and as Jackie was alluding to, civic engagement and community representation goes beyond voting and elections and the members who are elected. We would like for you to consider representation on boards, committees, and commissions as a civic duty. Here you see a graph of underrepresentation on boards. It comes from a report from 2021 titled "The Journey Towards Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Boards of Directors in the Rochester Nonprofit Sector." We see that 81% of all officers on local boards are non-Latino whites. And overall, all minority groups are still underrepresented. Next slide. With a major underrepresentation of Latinos, in all levels of board participation, especially when compared to the total population and percentage in Monroe County. As you can see, individuals who identify as sorry, the host muted me.
Sorry.
It's okay. As you can see, individuals who identify as white make up approximately 70% of Monroe County's population, but have an overrepresentation on boards per this report, with African Americans being reported as slightly underrepresented and Latinos having an at least 5% gap in representation. Next slide. This last slide shows that an overall representation and lack of representation leads to a pipeline of less opportunity for committee board chairmanships and candidates for those chairmanships. Next slide. Therefore, without intentional outreach and partnerships, we have seen a lack of moving the needle. In 2017, La Cumbre, along with United Way, sent a letter to over 50 organizations, committees, organizations, and commissions in the greater Rochester area. At this time, those organizations were identified as organizations who directly impacted the life of individuals in our minority communities. That outreach was intentional. The purpose was to identify opportunities for organizations to be partnered with potential board members. The letter only received 13 responses. What we know is that when boards, committees, and commissions are diverse, the organizations function better. The organizations are actually more financially stable and reach out to the communities at higher rates. Next slide. When we talk about boards, committees, and commissions, we cannot talk about and not talk about boards, committees, and commissions, fiduciaries, responsibilities, the dollars and the cents. As a committee, we continue to champion for things like Latina pay equity, because we know that even in 2021, Latinas are still making 55 cents to the dollar. Being the lowest paid demographic of all of the largest demographics in our community. We believe this to be a direct correlation to how lived experiences are needed to diversify boards, committees, and commissions, and challenge you to understand the disparities in pay. Advocate for changes like salary range transparency. Furthermore, we recommend you look at your fiduciary responsibilities on boards. A board with a $10,000 fiduciary responsibility may have some diversity, but we can assure you that the statistics speak loud. And because of structural isms, many individuals like myself with lived experiences are left out. Next slide. Jackie will now discuss our key priorities and recommendations.
So these are
This is a
just
heads up to the group. You have 1 minute. Thank you.
okay. These are just a few of the recommendations, and we can certainly talk more about these in the breakout session. So just really, just very quickly, the titles. Representation must be equal and proportionate. That you must be intentional and committed to providing information strongly endorsed by the Latinx community. Champion meaningful and consistent engagement within the community, and support mandated annual diversity, equity, inclusion trainings for all government entities, and quite frankly, within the private industry as well. So I'll leave it at that, and we can again discuss more in the breakout sessions. And thank you, everyone. These are a couple of the quick questions. Again, we will revisit those at that time. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Telva Oliveras, and I'm an internist psychiatrist at the University of Rochester. And my area of interest is to deliver care to Latino populations. Next. The Latino community is affected by health disparities like many other marginalized communities. These are based on differences that we find in their social environment, economic status, physical environment, the lack of health insurance, and mostly the language and cultural barriers that really affect the quality of care that Latinos receive in our healthcare system to really represent unequal care. Perhaps the greatest inequality in health is that a child born in the city of Rochester will live 10 years less than a child born in the suburbs of Rochester. And that is something that should be unacceptable to all of us. Next. According to the WHO organization, the health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, which is a very ambitious definition in and of itself. It clearly has changed over the year. We also think about health and take into account what people think their health status is and how stable chronic conditions are. Latinos face severe vulnerability when it comes to mental health and increasing rates of substance use disorder. Despite multiple attempts at increasing access to treatment, there still remains gaps that are significant in our care. Next. Just as a background to summarize about the emergency department visits for Latinos for anxiety, depression, and stress increased 96% between 2009, and 2018, which is a significant increase. 29% of Latino students report that they've had at least 3 or more ACEs, or adverse childhood events. Between 2018 and 2019, the overdose deaths for Latinos more than doubled, from 7.7% to 15.5%. And finally, and really significant, is that the analysis by Common Ground Health in 2018 showed that Latinos think that their number one identified concern is mental health and their emotional health. Next. In order to really start to think about delivering equitable care to Latino populations, a comprehensive approach is needed to address all these vulnerabilities. Some of these include increasing cultural competency amongst our healthcare providers, decreasing language barriers for Latino populations, fostering a diverse, inclusive environment where we can foment trustworthiness and security and a safe space for Latinos, and expanding services and programs so that they can be reached by all. Next. A focus of our recommendations will be bilingual services. And just to emphasize that a lot of services or programs or even agency have no concept that there is a best practice for bilingual services. The national standards of the culturally and linguistic appropriate services in health and healthcare, or CLAS, delivers 15 standards in their document that provides individuals and organizations really a very fine blueprint of how to successfully implement and maintain culturally and linguistic appropriate services. Wanting to point out that language access needs to be addressed or noted and identified at all points of entry, from a secretary or receptionist that's bilingual to answering a phone by a bilingual recipient, and even voicemails and the likes needs to be addressed in the patient's language. Next. So some people, when you look at what people talk about being bilingual or delivering bilingual bicultural services, people sometimes identify the agency utilizes a member, or they might have one staff member that speaks Spanish and they can provide interpreter services. Some agencies have some language proficient staff, but are not intentionally assigned to care for same language patients. And I notice I put the word have proficient, because knowing a language does not mean that you have the capability to interpret. You really need to vet language skills in the appropriate science or in medicine. There's a lot of medical terminology that not all interpreters know. And there needs to be a clear sensitivity that we can address those in a timely manner. So as you can see, a lot of these agencies go through the continuum. Not everybody meets the 15 standards, but I think a goal should be to continuously improve and increase the class standards so that you can meet as many of the class standards available and can be assured that you're providing equal care to all. Next. The recommendations of these reports are 3. First is to form partnerships that really help to innovate ways of addressing the social determinants of health, and also to address partnerships that really foment this idea of being strongly affecting the healthcare outcomes that we wish. Language access and cultural competency and health literacy is something we are very much advocating for. There is a scarcity of providers in the community that are actually bilingual or even bicultural. And this not only leads to unequal care, but mistrust and lack of, we know that there's a lack of compliance with recommendations when there is distrust and a language disparity. Finally, behavioral health and substance use disorder have been addressed by our community as their number one main concern. And we implore everybody to help us reduce the gap in access to quality behavioral health and substance use disorder. And maybe one of those approaches might be through a community-based intervention, such as training lay workers, peer recovery coaches as integral parts of the service plans and the service team. Next.
This is Lucia Colindres speaking. I'm also a member of the roundtable. We will cover the storytelling during our breakout session, and we'll also address the questions. I would like to introduce you now to our arts and culture section.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Paredes, and I am one of the co-founders of the Rochester Latino Theater Company, and I will be serving as the moderator today. Our presenters today are Annette Jimenez Gleason from the Rochester Area Community Foundation, Nidia Padilla Rodriguez, she is the founder of the Borinquen Dance Theater, and Annette Ramos from the City Arts Commission, AC3. Rochester is the cultural capital of upstate New York. And as the third largest metro in New York State, we offer an abundance of cultural experiences and institutions that it's not just a tourist attraction here in Rochester. They are embedded into our heart of the community. Rochester has been named the 17th most arts vibrant city in the country by the National Center for Arts Research, ranking along large cities such as New York City, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. From public art on our city streets to music, dance, and theater, there is always something to see and do as you explore our creative city. There has been an incredible movement in Rochester to add our Latinx voices, presence, and talents to this great city that we live in. We are not looking for statements of support or just a presence on stage or behind the scenes. We are looking for action, and we are looking for equity. We are looking for our presence at the table where decisions are being made. We don't want to see it if you don't expect us to talk. We don't want to partner if it isn't long-term or sustainable. We want a true partnership, authentic work being done, and true collaboration, inclusion, and equity. When we begin our conversations in our breakout room, we will be discussing our community agreements so that we can all be on the same page on how we can focus our time together. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Annette Ramos to get a little bit more information on the anti-racist framework approach. Annette?
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. We really looked at arts and culture and the anti-racist framework approach, really looking at moving beyond statements and catchphrases, but really diving into the internal structure of art organizations and where you're missing the mark and how we can support your art organization to bring true equity, inclusion, and diversity at all levels. So next slide, please. We will discuss in our small breakout rooms the change of culture and how to bring BIPOC artists, specifically Latin artists, to your organization at multiple levels. We want to discuss and really review your policies and practices internally, how you approach hiring practices, as well as how you create forward-facing organizations that are inclusive and inviting to all. And then, of course, the essence of the work, the art itself. Next slide, please. Social justice is very much part of what's on the forefront of every art organization. We want this experience to be authentic and engaging with the Brown and Black community, having diverse art organizers at your tables in the planning, the implementing, the hiring, and then, of course, the actual art itself. Accessibility to these programs is also very critical. Oftentimes, times we get the call saying, well, I don't know how to reach the Latino community. So these are really about changing the systemic systems internally within your art organization. We also want you, the art organizations, to participate in a holistic way, that it's not just a transactional interaction, but a sustainable long-term collaborating partnership. And then also to have a clear understanding of the history of the culture with which you want to engage and invite in. Next slide, please. I will now have Annette Jimenez speak about what is the current status of Latino arts and culture in the Rochester region. Annette Jimenez.
Thank you. In a recent webinar that I attended featuring Latino arts fellows with the Whitney Museum, one of the artists made a statement that arts is truth-telling. And really what we're talking about today is that there are many disparities that persist regarding representation and funding for Latino artists. As noted in the full report, Rochester has the second largest population of Latinos in New York State, but it does not have a central home for Latino arts. And there's no central single entity to advocate for and represent Latin artists, to allow for active participation in informing policies and investments within our local governments and major art institutions. And that lack of visibility can be connected to funding. Prior to the pandemic, funding of cultural arts had become increasingly less equitable, as a study from the CERDNA Foundation found, with only 2% of cultural institutions receiving nearly 60% of all contributed funding. In Monroe County pre-pandemic, only 13% of arts organizations were led by Black, Indigenous, or people of color, whereas the non-white population totals 30%, according to analysis of US Census data and nonprofit data. Of the 13%, only 5 organizations were led by Latino artists, and none have budgets nearing $1 million. What are the factors that contribute to the disparity in funding and lower number of arts nonprofits led by artists of color? Latinos, includes a lack of awareness of funding or grant opportunities, a disconnect between funders and arts groups, and a lack of transparency in the processes for arts funding at the city and Monroe County levels. Work is underway to improve those at the city and county levels to address transparency and artist representation on funding for the arts, including a community committee working with city officials, the AC3 that was mentioned, that is planning for the creation of a city arts commission office. The commission would serve in an advisory capacity to the mayor and city council to promote, encourage, and increase support for our Rochester artistic and cultural assets, which are integral to our community and showcase Rochester as a tourist destination. Local foundations, I can attest, are striving to improve outreach to connect Latin artists and arts groups with grant opportunities. At the Community Foundation, there is currently a partnership with NISCA, specifically designed to meet that purpose. And we look forward to the discussions in our breakout rooms so that we can work collectively to provide greater support for our vibrant Latino arts. Next slide.
Thank you, Annette. So the recommendations in the report, we have chosen these 3 to focus in on. Looking at the national level, the National Endowment of the Arts, and having a art community liaison to really speak to the needs of the Rochester Latino and Latinx arts community. As Annette Jimenez shared, NYSCA, New York State Council of the Arts, which funds state arts initiatives, it's central and important for them to also view and see the needs of Brown artists, specifically in a region that is heavily populated within our community. And the third is really looking at the local level within the city and the county, but specifically to the art organizations that serve our community. How are you and we working together to ensure that Brown artists are represented at every level of your organization? Next slide, please. Stephanie will share within our small group this wonderful Google board, which we will then create our recommendations and responses. And the question that we're really asking are about local art organizations. How can you change the equitable funding opportunities, and how can you increase Latin representation within your organization? So I think that concludes arts and culture, and now language access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. We will throw it over to Marlene Cortez to get us started with language access. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the language access portion of this summit. My name is Marlene Cortez. I am the co-founder of the Monroe County Language Access Coalition and senior manager at Empire Justice Center. Along with the Latinx Language Access Committee listed below, we have put together the following presentation as we continue to discuss the crucial importance of language access in the framework of diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. Next slide. Hopefully you all had the opportunity to read the Language Access Agenda Report. These are some of the critical and vital definitions of the Comprehensive Language Access Plan as recommended by the report. It is just not providing interpretation and translation services, but going beyond that to fully address the language barriers and understand the culture component in our community. Next slide. New York State is home to 5.5 million New Yorkers that speak a language other than English. 2.5 million of those New Yorkers are not proficient in English, meaning English is their second language or they can't speak or read English at all. 40,000 live in Monroe County. Even though this information is in the report, we're showing you these numbers again, since we continue to struggle with accessibility in obtaining just the basic needs for communities with language barriers. COVID has ripped the bandage of language access, and we're still struggling. Next slide. Camila.
Bueno, y ahora queremos invitarlos a que se pongan en el lugar de las personas que no hablan inglés. Estamos más o menos a la mitad del camino en las presentaciones y espero que todos estén poniendo mucha atención. Pero imagínense que llegan al hospital con un dolor incontrolable. I'm sure most of you are wondering, did I understand what she said? Was she speaking English? Did I miss switching to the interpreter channel? Am I in the right presentation? And I apologized with the ASL interpreter because I didn't tell her I was doing this, but note that also the interpreter was cut off, as all of you were. Well, the answer to the last question is yes, you are in the right place. And we just wanted to begin this slide by giving you a hint of what it feels like to not speak the language that is spoken around you. So I want you to try to put yourself in this scenario. Imagine you are a mother. You have been having severe vaginal bleeding for the last 4 hours, and it is clear that it's not going to stop anytime soon. So you decide to go to the emergency department. Your 10-year-old son needs to come with you because you cannot leave him home alone. During your interaction with the doctor, you are in pain, and the doctor doesn't offer to call for an interpreter because he has noticed that your child speaks English, and so he starts using him, your child, for the job. Part of the questions the doctor asks relate to your private parts, and you must relate your pain and your experience through your 10-year-old son while feeling the embarrassment and incredibly unfair load of doing something like this. At the same time, the doctor is saying things like, we have to do a vaginal exam and an intravaginal ultrasound to rule out cystic fibrosis, et cetera, et cetera. And your 10-year-old son is supposed to know what these terms are and efficiently and accurately interpret this back to you so that you can actually understand what is going on and what needs to happen. This is a real scenario. So imagine this is you. Now, we know our main focus has been Spanish because the population is really big here in Rochester and in the United States in general, but this situation affects all minority populations, including all spoken languages and sign languages like ASL. I just want you to take a minute to imagine yourself in these other scenarios. Can you see how scary that would be, right? Next slide, please.
This is Marlene. This slide shows the top 4 spoken languages within the limited English proficient communities in Monroe County. As you can see, Spanish is the largest minority spoken language. Language barriers affect all aspects of someone's life, someone's basic need, from education to healthcare, finances, and housing. Next slide. These are the 5 elements of an effective language access plan. These elements are increasingly becoming the standard for quality of care and services. For instance, if an entity that receives federal funding, they're required to comply with federal language access requirements outlined in Title VI, Executive Order 13166. Having a written language access plan that includes these 5 elements brings clarity to these legal requirements. Next slide. Here are the legal obligations that we stated in the previous slide. Under federal guidance, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Executive Order 13166 speaks directly to language access and providing a language access plan. As we spoke earlier, language access is part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility work, as it's directly connected to the Civil Rights Act. New York State has a language access executive order as well, which is Executive Order 26. New York State Human Rights Law, Law 296, and the New York State Civil Rights Law, Section 40 and 40C. We'll provide these links to these laws for further clarity during our breakout room. Next slide. And now to get into the action. What are your next steps in this work? Here is a list of 5 steps to move this work forward. Following these steps will help start bridging the gaps in services in our community, start dismantling language barriers. You cannot work on diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility without addressing language barriers. Next slide. Our report's recommendation on what needs to be done next: if create or update your organization's language access plan. If you're a funder and you have people applying for funding, ask for a language access plan. Is that included interpretation, translation included in the applicant or in the budget? You can advocate for language access and for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. These are the 3 recommendations that we're making to update your organizations, and providing funding require applicants to provide their language access plan as part of their budget. This will outline how they will do their work with these communities. Next slide. Here's a list of resources that you can take back to your organization and start putting together a language access plan. We can go into further details of these links in our breakout rooms. In our breakout room, you'll have the opportunity to discuss the following questions with language access advocates in our community, and what the next steps will be. And now turn it back to Anthony.